Today I want to talk about Genghis Khan's grandson, particularly Kublai Khan, who is sometimes called the Great Khan. So if you see the green area of the map right here, this is the area that was ruled by Kublai Khan, and this includes what is current day China. And so Kublai Khan is credited with the unification of China, and he's credited with the establishment of the Yuan dynasty. You can see in the other sections, after Genghis Khan's death and after his son's death, the Mongol Empire was divided into something called a Khanate. So we have the Golden Horde, which went up into Russia, and we have the Chagatai Khanate, which went into Central Asia, and then of course we have the Khanate, which went on to conquer Baghdad. But today we're really going to be focusing on the green section, the Khanate of the Great Khan, and Kublai Khan's rule in Baghdad, or I'm sorry, rule in Beijing. Okay, so here's a quick timeline. You don't necessarily have to write this down, but just for reference, some time. Genghis Khan died in about 1227. His son Ogadai takes control, but dies shortly after in 1241. And then we're seeing that 1258, as you know, is the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate to the Khanate, as we talked about. And the conflict and the struggle for land between his grandchildren, his grandsons, was real and was ongoing for many years, for about 15 years, or I guess 13 years. But my math still isn't right on that. What is that? 23 years, I guess. And so anyway, he had many, many sons and grandsons. And so the fact that these, oops, sorry, the fact that these five are the ones, or four are the ones who actually got to rule, was the result of an ongoing period of struggle and of battle and of war to take their territory. So in 1264, Kublai Khan takes over the Chinese portion of the Mongol Empire, and in 1279, he successfully defeats the southern Sung dynasty to unite China and form the Yuan dynasty. In 1294, we see the death of Kublai Khan. So we will talk about the Yuan dynasty. So this is what you're seeing here, the Khanate of the Great Khan, or the Yuan dynasty. And you can see the current day borders of China and Mongolia. So you can see that the Yuan dynasty was a great deal bigger than current day China, and extended far up into Mongolia. So the Mongols are successful at uniting the northern Sung, which they unite first. And the northern Sung is pretty much, up the part up here that's really closest to Mongolia. And that contains a lot of groups that were very familiar with the Mongols, such as the Jurchens, and the Jin dynasty, which also had previously been familiar with the Mongols. And they fell relatively quickly and easily. But the southern Song put up a pretty formidable fight for the Mongols, and it was really, really gruesome and ongoing. And so we're going to see the implications of that whenever China starts, or Kublai Khan starts to rule, that the southern Sung dynasty down here and Kublai Khan have a particular dislike of each other, and the southern Sung have a particular vengeance and hatred of Kublai Khan. Okay, so this is Kublai Khan, very, very famous in world history, and Kublai Khan means the Great Khan. And so, yeah, like I said, he's known for leading the Mongol army to conquer the southern Sung and creating the Yuan dynasty. I think you should write this down. Whether you need to write it down word for word is up to you, but definitely know what the Yuan dynasty is and know what Kublai is, who Kublai is. And it's worth knowing some of his accomplishments. So, and I'll tell you, there's a couple other vocab words in here that you should definitely write down. So he moves the capital from Karakoram to Beijing. So Beijing now becomes a thriving city within the Chinese dynasty. And you guys read about that in your Mongol moment reading. But as we're going to explore, Kublai is different from Genghis Khan because Genghis Khan put less of a focus throughout his lifetime on his ruling practices. Although we know that he did do that towards the end of his life, he was mostly focusing on his conquering practices while Kublai Khan was focusing on ruling. So if you look at the yellow box here, this is a really important thing to note, and it should not be understated. China has a long and enduring history of thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and the longest country to be continuously ruled by dynasties. And this is the first time in Chinese history that a dynasty is run by a leader and a group of people who are not ethnically Han Chinese. And that is the Chinese ethnic majority. So that is a big deal. And it's a big deal because the Chinese have a certain set of beliefs and values that they carry with them from dynasty to dynasty, and the Mongols are going to disrupt that. So even to this day, the Chinese learn about the Mongols differently. They learn about them as invaders and disruptors to something that was a uniform line of Chinese rule. Okay, So let's just really quickly talk about the social hierarchy. Who is getting priority? Who's getting the best treatment? How are things working under the Yuan dynasty social hierarchy? So of course the Mongols get treated the best. They get the highest social priority. They get the easiest access to government positions, and they're ranked the highest. The second highest would be any person in the Chinese Yuan dynasty who is not Chinese. So the Muslim people, the Jurchens, who I mentioned before, from up in northern China near Mongolia, anyone who is not Chinese. And then we have the Northern Sung dynasty, so the northern Chinese people, because if you remember, they put up less of a fight for the Mongols, and it was less of an enduring battle. And the lowest, by far, the most poorly treated in the Yuan dynasty are the Southern Sung, because they were resistant to the Mongols and they had to be brutally conquered. And so there is no good feelings there. And so they are treated with the least amount of privilege. So let's talk a little bit about the life of peasants. Um, Mongols supported peasants. They believed in the mission of peasants, right? That peasants, the success of peasants, bring in economic success for the country, and they bring in money that will benefit the Mongols. So they enact tax reform so that the peasants get a tax break, and they create or enact these something called a grain share house, which was essentially just a storage house for surplus grain that then people who were experiencing famine could go to and take surplus grain. So it was very humanitarian and trying to help struggling peasants. Um, and throughout the course of these brutal wars that had happened, with the Mongols conquering China, a lot of their war land or their farmland had been destroyed by war. And, that was very important for the peasants' survival. So the Mongols went in and they said, listen, we understand that you lost a lot of your farmland because of our war. So we will come in and we will fix that farmland so that you can more successfully uh, grow food and sell your food. Um, and they taught them how to do it, um, and they taught them how to be more successful farmers. They also prevented their nomadic animals, such as horses, from grazing on crops, because they understood the importance of being able to feed an empire. And they created farming cooperatives, which, like I said, were meant to teach people how to farm better and more efficiently. The negative aspect would be that they did use peasants for forced labor, especially on the Grand Canal, which I'm going to talk about what that is. So, in general, peasants had uh, an improved social status, an improved government oversight and government lifeline, but there were certainly things that still kept them peasants and still restricted their freedoms. So not everything was positive for the peasants. Okay, let's quickly talk about the Grand Canal. Here's a map of the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal was historically created during the Qin Dynasty in 221 BCE. Right, so this is a long time ago. I mean, you talked about the Qin Dynasty last year. It was very effective in its unification of China because it unified the entirety of the east coast of China. But you can see the parts on the screen where it says Yuan Dynasty, as opposed to Sui. Um, so look for the parts that say Yuan, and those are the additions that the Yuan dynasty made. And really, you'll notice what they're doing is extending the Grand Canal to the major cities. So in particular, Beijing, they add this last little extension to Beijing. It's not really little, but they add this last extension to Beijing. This is a massive project. These are hundreds and hundreds of miles of digging out canals and then filling them. Um, and it required a large workforce of peasants, and it was incredibly expensive. So this is something that requires an investment by the Mongols, by the Yuan dynasty, and requires peasant labor. But the payoff is also very big in enhanced communication and trade with the capital city and increase the productivity and connectedness of China long after the Yuan dynasty was done, long after the Mongols had left. This legacy endures. So the Grand Canal was one of those public works projects that was ultimately very successful, and just shows you that it pays to invest in infrastructure. Okay, let's talk briefly about some of his military successes and failures. This is a good way to talk about some of the parts of the failures of the Yuan dynasty. So they're very successful in certain ways. They're successful at uniting China and defeating the Song dynasty in 1279, um, and then even progressing a little bit further. So that is really their ultimate military success. Then they continued into parts of Southeast Asia, when they were successful in some of the initial attacks in Southeast Asia, but really they didn't manage to hold on to any true landholds down in Southeast Asia. In Japan, the Mongols were repeatedly unsuccessful. So they lost in Japan in both 1274 and 1281, twice because of typhoons. Um, and the Japanese really thought that these typhoons were, um, you know, clandestine or were predestined, from above, sending them to help the Japanese people evade the Mongols. But that is how the Mongols were pushed out of Japan and never successfully were able to take a stronghold there. So there's a depiction of the Mongols' attack on Japan. Okay, um, I just kind of want to quickly talk about the difference between Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan. So Kublai Khan wants to rule the Yuan dynasty. Genghis Khan was much more focused on territorial expansion. Uh, and then something I didn't really highlight when I talked about Kublai Khan is um, his valuing of the Chinese system. He is a Mongol and he does have Mongol tendencies. He has a commitment to Mongol values, but he was born and raised in China. He speaks Chinese. He hires Chinese bureaucrats in his government. He implements Chinese rituals into his government. So he is very much, the word we use is Sinicizing China. So let me the word on the screen, sinicization or sinicization. That prefix, sino, S-I-N-O, that means Chinese, to make something more Chinese, sinicization. So what Kublai Khan, we see him do is adapting his policies to fit in with Chinese culture. Or another way to say this is to make something Chinese. Okay, so look for this in his style, look for this in his policies. When is he making things Chinese? The other thing that Kublai Khan did is something called benevolent rule. So he was um, inclined to implement policies that would benefit his people. And so you see this a lot with things like the share houses, right? Where he would share grain with underperforming peasants and poor peasants. So at this point, you can really go through and see when he's using synesthesia and when he's using benevolent rule. I kind of went through, normally we do this in class, but I kind of went through and did this for you and separated his policies, but definitely screenshot this, take a look at this. Um, which ones fit with making things more Chinese, supporting Chinese art, supporting Chinese religions, and then benevolent rule, which would be things that benefit the citizens, policies that are kind and helpful. Okay, I'm almost done. I just have one more slide. I know this is pretty long. So Kublai Khan's balance between Chinese ideas and Mongolian roots is something that really takes hold in his legacy. I keep using this word legacy to refer to both him and his grandfather Genghis. So I want you to consider this. How does he reflect both Mongolian values and also Chinese values? His support of foreigners, people like Marco Polo and other foreigners who would come, very, very supportive and kind to them. Um, how does he support merchants and peasants and artisans? What are some of his failed military campaigns, and how would history have been different if he did not fail in those endeavors? And then think about his collapse and weakening control. I mean, relatively, the Mongolian Yuan dynasty was pretty short in the scope of Chinese history. And the next time we revisit China, we're going to be revisiting the Ming dynasty, which starts in 1368. So we're really only talking about 150, 200 years of Yuan dynasty rule, which is very small in Chinese terms. But in just 200 years, they did make an enduring impact. So I think that's important to know. All right, I am done here. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of what the Mongols did in China. Thanks, guys.